Under the golden light of a fading western sun, a young orphan girl carried a quiet grace that few ever noticed. She arrived at the ranch with nothing but a small bundle of clothes and eyes that had already seen too much of life's cruelty. The rancher's wife had passed, leaving behind 3 restless children and a home heavy with silence. No one expected the frail girl to last a week. Yet, as the winds howled across the plains and loneliness settled like dust, she became the gentle heartbeat that held the family together. She mended torn shirts, wiped tears that weren't her own, and soothed nightmares that belonged to children who had forgotten what comfort felt like. Her hands were small, but her kindness filled every corner of that broken home. Even the rancher, hardened by years of labor and loss, found his grief easing when he heard her hum by the fireplace. She asked for nothing, not even gratitude, content to serve in silence while the world around her learned to breathe again. But the town saw only what they wanted to see: a poor orphan working beneath her station, a girl whose worth could be measured by the chores she performed. They whispered about her in the saloon and mocked the rancher for allowing a stray into his home. Yet none of them saw the quiet strength in her smile, or the way the children clung to her like sunlight after a long winter. She had become the soul of a house once haunted by sorrow. Among those who watched her from afar was a poor cowboy, a man known more for his honesty than his fortune. He worked the nearby lands, enduring ridicule much like her own. When his path crossed hers for the first time, he was struck not by her beauty, but by the quiet fire behind her humility. He saw in her something he recognized within himself, the strength to endure without bitterness. And one evening, when the rancher's children ran into his arms with laughter instead of tears, the poor cowboy fell to his knees before her, not out of pity, but reverence. For he understood what the world did not, that the orphan girl had not only healed a broken home, but reminded every soul who crossed her path that goodness, though often silent, carries a power no wealth could ever match. The days passed slowly on the ranch, each sunrise painting the sky with dust and gold. The orphan girl worked from dawn to dusk, never once complaining, never once asking for rest. She rose before the children awoke, and was the last to sleep after the fires burned low. Her touch softened even the harshest corners of the old rancher's world. The children, once wild and grieving, began to laugh again. Their father, once cold and distant, found himself watching her in quiet wonder, as though her kindness had given him back something he thought he had lost forever: hope. The cowboy often passed through those lands delivering supplies, his boots worn and hat low to shield his eyes from the relentless sun. He'd stop by the ranch, sometimes to help mend a fence, other times to share a quiet meal after a long ride. Each time he saw the girl, something inside him stirred, a mix of admiration and sorrow. She reminded him of a life he'd long abandoned, of gentleness he believed the West had burned out of men like him. He never spoke much, but his silence carried gratitude deeper than words. The townsfolk still gossiped, their tongues sharp as spurs. They called the girl naive, said she didn't belong among ranchers and cowboys. Yet, behind their jealousy was a truth they refused to speak aloud. She had become something they all needed, but didn't know how to be: selfless. Her spirit shamed their bitterness. Her compassion exposed their emptiness. And so, they hid their envy behind laughter, while secretly watching her as one might watch the first flower bloom after a long drought. The rancher's children adored her. The youngest, a boy barely 6, began calling her Mama, though she never claimed the title. She'd tuck them in with stories of angels and stars, whispering prayers over their dreams. When they cried for the mother they had lost, she held them without a word, her tears falling silently onto their hair. Her love was quiet, steady, and pure, born not from duty, but from a longing to belong. And though she never said it, the girl carried her own ache, a loneliness that no act of kindness could fully erase. She had found a family, yes, but not yet a home that was truly hers. The cowboy saw it in her eyes each time their paths crossed, a silent yearning, a question she didn't dare to ask. And deep down, he wondered if he might one day be the answer. As the seasons changed, the bond between the girl and the cowboy deepened in the simplest of ways. A shared meal under the cottonwood trees, a quiet nod at sunset, the brief brush of hands as they passed each other tools. He spoke little, but his presence lingered, steady, dependable, much like the land itself. He had nothing to offer her but his heart, and even that he guarded fiercely, for fear that she deserved more than a poor man's devotion. Yet, every glance they shared told her what words could not, that he saw her, truly saw her, when the rest of the world looked past. One evening, a storm rolled over the plains, dark and unforgiving. The wind howled like a wounded beast, and lightning split the sky. When the roof of the children's room began to cave, the orphaned girl threw herself into the rain, her body shielding them from falling beams. The rancher found her the next morning, drenched and trembling, clutching the youngest child in her arms. She had saved their lives without thought for her own. Word spread through the town faster than wildfire, and for the first time, the whispers fell silent. Even the cruelest tongues found no strength to mock a girl who had faced death for love that wasn't even her blood. The cowboy arrived days later, his horse weary from the long ride through the storm. When he saw her, pale but alive, a weight lifted from his chest he hadn't known he carried. He knelt before her, not in pity but reverence. To him, she was not the orphan girl anymore. She was the embodiment of everything pure that the West had forgotten. The roughness of his hands trembled as he took hers, and in that small gesture, gratitude turned into something deeper, something sacred. Yet, behind the gratitude lay a truth too heavy to ignore. The rancher, once grateful, began to see what others saw, the tenderness between them. He loved the girl in his own, quiet way, though he could never admit it aloud. And as he watched the cowboy's eyes linger on her, jealousy began to stir like a rattlesnake beneath the floorboards. The West was a place of pride, and pride could destroy faster than bullets. Still, for now, peace held. The children laughed again, the ranch thrived, and the girl continued her quiet work, unaware that destiny was already weaving threads of love and heartbreak through every dawn that passed. In her innocence, she had healed the wounds of a house, but in doing so, she had awakened the hearts of two men whose souls would soon collide beneath the burning sky. The air on the ranch began to change, subtle at first, like the calm before a storm that no one could yet name. The rancher, once kind and reserved, grew quieter, his glances toward the orphaned girl longer and heavier. He could not explain what he felt. Perhaps it was gratitude that had grown into affection, or perhaps it was loneliness dressed as love. But what he knew was that every time the cowboy arrived, laughter seemed to fill the house again, and it burned something deep within him. Pride and longing, those twin devils of the West, began their slow, inevitable dance in his chest. The girl sensed the shift but said nothing. Her heart was gentle, but not blind. She had seen what jealousy could do to men, how it turned good hearts to stone and turned neighbors into enemies. She prayed that it wouldn't reach this house, the one she had worked so hard to mend. And yet, each time the cowboy's name was spoken, the rancher's jaw would tighten ever so slightly. The children, unaware of the tension, adored both men, one their father, the other their quiet hero who always brought small gifts from the trail. One evening, the cowboy arrived carrying a wooden toy horse he had carved himself. The youngest child squealed with delight, and the girl's smile lit the porch like a lantern in the dark. But behind them, the rancher's shadow grew longer in the doorway. He forced a smile, masking the ache that clawed at his chest. The cowboy, ever respectful, tipped his hat and prepared to leave early, but the rancher stopped him, his tone polite, his words sharp as barbed wire. He thanked the man for his help, but made it clear that his visits were no longer welcome. The silence that followed was heavier than gunpowder. The girl's heart twisted, caught between loyalty and grief. She wanted to speak, to bridge the rift before it tore everything apart, but the look in the rancher's eyes silenced her. It was not anger she saw, it was pain, and in that pain, she understood. The man who had lost a wife now feared losing his heart again, this time to someone he could never be. The cowboy left without protest, his hat low and his pride lower. He rode into the night, the wind cold against his face, carrying the weight of a love he could neither claim nor kill. Behind him, the orphan girl stood at the window, tears glimmering in the moonlight, watching the only man who had ever truly understood her disappear into the endless West. Days turned into weeks, and the ranch fell back into uneasy rhythm. The girl continued her work, caring for the children, tending to the home, and masking her sorrow beneath the calmness she had mastered. Yet, the silence between her and the rancher deepened. He tried to speak at times, tried to bridge the chasm he had opened, but guilt chained his words. He had driven away the man who made her smile, and every quiet evening was now haunted by the ghost of that choice. The children, too, felt the change. Their laughter had dimmed, replaced by questions the girl couldn't answer. They asked when the cowboy would return, when he would tell them more stories of the trail. She could only smile weakly, saying he was away on long rides, though her heart ached with the lie. In truth, she feared he would never return. Not to this place where kindness had turned to envy, and love had been mistaken for betrayal. But fate, as it always does in the Old West, had its own designs. One morning, as the rancher and his men prepared to move cattle, a rider appeared on the horizon, dust rising behind him like a trail of memory. It was the cowboy. His clothes were worn, his face hardened by the road, yet his eyes still carried that same quiet gentleness. He had not come for her, not in defiance or anger, but because the rancher's herd had been ambushed by thieves in the night. Despite his wounds, he had come to warn them. When their eyes met again, time seemed to stop. She wanted to thank him, to speak all the words her heart had carried in silence, but there was no time. The rancher's men gathered their rifles and rode out toward the canyon where the herd had vanished. The cowboy, without hesitation, mounted his horse once more to ride beside them. The rancher, pride still flickering like a dying flame, said nothing, but deep down, he knew he owed this man his trust. As they disappeared into the horizon, the orphan girl stood on the porch once again, praying under her breath. The West had a way of testing the hearts of men, not through words or promises, but through danger and sacrifice. And she feared that by the time the sun set, one of them might never ride home again. The sun beat mercilessly over the canyon as the rancher's men rode through the dust, their rifles gleaming under the harsh light. The cowboy led the way, his instincts sharper than any map. He had seen the tracks, the broken brush, the faint prints of hooves, signs of thieves who knew the land too well. The rancher rode beside him in silence, torn between gratitude and pride, aware that the very man he had cast out now risked his life for him. The wind carried no sound but the rhythmic pounding of hooves, each step echoing the tension between them. When they reached the ravine, the silence shattered. A gunshot rang out, followed by another. Bullets tore through the dust, sending horses rearing and men scattering for cover. The ambush had come swiftly from the cliffs above. The rancher fired blindly into the rocks, his heart hammering in his chest. But it was the cowboy who acted with calm precision. He dismounted, crawling through the dirt, positioning himself between the gunman and the rancher. Even amidst the chaos, his purpose was clear: protect, not revenge. The thieves were desperate men, outlaws driven by hunger and greed. Their eyes burned with the madness of survival. Yet, they found themselves outmatched by the cowboy's steady hand. He fired with the certainty of someone who had faced death before and no longer feared it. But as one final shot cracked through the air, the cowboy turned to push the rancher out of harm's way, and the bullet struck him instead. It hit his shoulder, spinning him backward into the dust. The gunfire stopped as quickly as it had begun. The outlaws, realizing their ambush had failed, fled into the hills, leaving behind the echo of their cowardice. The rancher knelt beside the fallen man, pressing his hand to the wound, his breath shaking. "Why?" he rasped. "Why save me after what I did to you?" The cowboy's voice, weak but steady, answered with words that silenced even the wind. "Because she would have wanted me to." Those words cut through the rancher like a blade. He understood then what the girl had seen in the cowboy, the quiet nobility that spoke not of pride or possession, but of love that expected nothing in return. And as they lifted him onto a horse to carry him home, the rancher made a vow in his heart. If the cowboy lived, he would make right what pride had broken. The journey back to the ranch was slow and heavy. The cowboy drifted in and out of consciousness, his skin pale beneath the setting sun. The orphan girl waited by the porch, her hands trembling as she spotted the wounded rider slumped over the saddle. She ran to him before the horses had even stopped, her voice breaking as she called his name. The sight of her tears stirred him awake for a moment, enough to whisper a faint smile. "You're safe," he murmured, before pain stole his strength again. They carried him inside, laying him on the bed where she had once nursed the children through their fevers. The rancher stood at the doorway, silent, watching as she worked with desperate care. Her hands did not shake, though her heart did. She cleaned the wound, tore strips from her own apron for bandages, and prayed under her breath between every heartbeat. The house, once quiet, was now filled with the heavy sound of struggle, the sound of a man fighting for his life, and a woman fighting for the chance to keep him in it. Night fell slow and merciless. The rancher sat outside, staring at the stars that stretched endlessly above the plains. For the first time in his life, he felt small, not because of loss or hardship, but because he had stood beside a man whose humility had shown him the measure of true greatness. He thought of the girl, of the love she had given so freely, and he realized he could no longer stand between her and the man who had earned her heart through sacrifice. Inside, the girl never left the cowboy's side. His breath came in shallow waves, his face pale against the lamplight. She held his hand, whispering stories of the children, of the laughter he had brought into their home, of the way his kindness had changed everything. Her tears fell freely now, landing on his skin like rain over dry earth. "Don't leave," she begged softly. "You promised you'd come back." And as the dawn began to break over the horizon, the cowboy's eyes fluttered open. He turned his head, weak but alive, and met her gaze. "I told you I'd always find my way back," he whispered. The faintest smile touched her lips, and for the first time, hope returned to the house that had been built on loss and reborn through love. But outside those walls, the West was still watching, waiting to see how far love and faith could carry two souls who had already given everything to the land that tested them. The days that followed were filled with slow healing, of wounds, of pride, of hearts that had long been burdened. The cowboy's strength returned little by little, though his body bore the marks of what he had endured. The orphan girl remained at his side through every sunrise and every restless night, her care as steady as the land itself. Sometimes, when pain stole his words, she would simply hold his hand and whisper stories of the children, of their laughter, of the peace that now seemed possible. Her voice became his medicine, her presence his reason to fight. The rancher watched in silence, his heart heavy with both gratitude and guilt. He saw how her hands trembled when the cowboy's fever spiked, how her eyes glowed each time he opened his. It was then that the truth settled upon him like a long-awaited dawn. She had never belonged to his household. She belonged to something greater, something freer. She was not his servant, not his charity, but a woman whose love had been earned through courage, humility, and faith. For the first time, he smiled when he saw her smile at another man. One evening, the rancher entered the room where the cowboy lay recovering. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. He removed his hat, his voice low and sincere. "You saved my life," he began, "and more than that, you saved my soul from pride. I drove you away because I couldn't bear to face what I'd lost. But I see now that God sent you here not to take from me, but to give her what I never could." The cowboy, weak but alert, nodded slowly. "She saved us both," he murmured. The two men sat in silence, the weight of rivalry fading into understanding. The rancher's eyes softened as he looked upon the man he had once envied. "You have my blessing," he said finally, his voice breaking slightly. "Not because you need it, but because she deserves a love that is honest." The cowboy's throat tightened, his gratitude too deep for words. He reached out, and the two men clasped hands, a gesture that sealed not just forgiveness, but brotherhood. That night, the girl found them on the porch, the lamp's warm glow wrapping them in quiet peace. For the first time in a long while, there was no tension, no grief, only stillness. She smiled softly, sensing that something sacred had passed between them. The rancher tipped his hat and walked away, leaving the two of them beneath the endless stars, their hearts finally free to beat without fear. The next morning dawned gentle and golden, the kind of sunrise that felt like a promise. The children ran through the fields, their laughter carrying on the wind. The cowboy, though still weak, stepped outside to feel the sun on his face. The orphan girl stood beside him, her hands folded together, her eyes reflecting the same light that touched the land. Neither spoke for a long time. Words, they knew, were too small for what they felt. When he finally turned to her, his voice was low, as if afraid to break the fragile peace between them. "You've given life to this place," he said. "To him, to those children, to me. I came here a poor man, but you've made me richer than I ever dreamed." She shook her head gently, her eyes shimmering. "You gave me something too," she whispered. "A reason to stay. Before you came, I was just surviving. You taught me what it means to be seen." He took her hand, roughened by work but soft with care. "Then let's stop surviving," he said quietly. "Let's start living." She smiled through tears, and the simplicity of his words became the most profound vow she had ever heard. It wasn't a proposal, not yet. It was a promise of shared life, built not from riches or status, but from the quiet strength that had carried them both through pain and fire. The rancher joined them later that morning, his children clinging to his hands. He looked upon the pair with peace in his eyes. There was no jealousy, no regret, only gratitude. He had lost much, but he had gained something eternal, the knowledge that love, when pure, is not possession but freedom. He extended his hand to the cowboy once more, sealing a bond that would outlive them all. And so, under the endless expanse of the western sky, the orphan girl, the poor cowboy, and the old rancher stood together, their lives forever entwined by kindness, forgiveness, and grace. Around them, the land stretched vast and unbroken, carrying their story into the wind, a tale of humility, sacrifice, and a love strong enough to heal even the wild heart of the West. Weeks turned into months, and peace settled over the ranch like a long-awaited rain. The fields began to bloom again, the cattle returned, and laughter filled the home that had once echoed with silence. The orphan girl, now no longer a stranger to belonging, became the heart of everything. She taught the children songs from her childhood, baked bread with the same love she once gave in silence, and carried in her eyes a serenity that made even the wildest days feel calm. The poor cowboy worked by her side, not as a visitor anymore, but as part of the land itself. Their bond had become something sacred, unspoken yet understood by everyone who saw them. The rancher found comfort in watching them, his pride transformed into peace. He spent his days mending fences and evenings sharing stories with his children. Sometimes, when the sun dipped behind the hills, he would sit alone on the porch and whisper a prayer of thanks, not for wealth, not for prosperity, but for the grace that had turned his pain into purpose. The cowboy and the girl had taught him that love was not about holding on, but about setting free, and in releasing what he once tried to claim, he had found his redemption. The town, too, began to change. Those who had once mocked the girl now spoke of her with respect. They saw how her gentleness had softened even the roughest hearts, how her presence had brought unity where division once thrived. Men who had once turned their backs now tipped their hats when she passed, and women whispered her name in prayers of gratitude for the example she had become. She had proven that grace could rise even in the dustiest corners of the West, and that true strength was never loud. It was quiet, steady, and kind. But even in peace, life on the frontier was never without trial. One harsh winter morning, a sickness swept through the valley, taking the strong and weak alike. The youngest of the rancher's children fell ill, and the same fear that once haunted the house returned. The girl stayed by his side, her sleepless eyes keeping vigil through the cold nights. The cowboy, worn and weary, worked tirelessly to fetch supplies and care for the others, his faith unbroken even as hope began to fade. When the fever finally broke, the house erupted in tears of relief. The boy opened his eyes, whispering her name with a weak smile. The girl wept openly, her hands trembling over his small frame. The cowboy placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch steady and sure. "You've saved him," he said softly, but she only shook her head through her tears. "No," she whispered. "We saved each other." Spring returned to the land, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers and the promise of new beginnings. The ranch had survived its storms, of jealousy, of fire, of sickness, and now stood as a symbol of everything the West could be when kindness led the way. The cowboy and the girl married quietly beneath the open sky, with only the rancher, the children, and the whispering wind as witnesses. There were no grand speeches, no music, only the solemn exchange of vows spoken with the weight of truth. Their hands met, rough from work but warm with devotion, and in that moment the world felt still. The rancher gave her away with pride shining through the lines of his weathered face. He placed her hand in the cowboy's and said simply, "You were the miracle this land needed." There was no envy in his heart, only peace. For in her happiness, he found his own. He knew the world would tell and retell their story, the tale of a poor cowboy, an orphan girl, and the house that love rebuilt. But he also knew that no telling would ever capture the depth of what they had endured together. As the sun sank below the horizon, the couple stood hand in hand, watching the sky blaze with color. Around them, the children played in the tall grass, their laughter rising into the air like music. The wind carried it far, across the plains, over the mountains, through the heart of the West, carrying with it a story that would outlive them all. The girl turned to her husband, her eyes soft, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think people like us can really change the world?" she asked. The cowboy smiled faintly, his gaze fixed on the glowing horizon. "We already have," he said. "Maybe not the whole world, but ours." And as darkness fell, the light in their home glowed brighter than ever before, a beacon against the vastness of the frontier, a testament that even in the roughest lands, goodness can take root. Their story was not one of riches or glory, but of grace, a story that proved that sometimes the smallest acts of love can echo louder than the roar of the wildest storm. In the stillness of the frontier, their story became more than memory. It became a lesson whispered across the wind. The orphan girl who once had nothing had taught an entire land what it meant to give everything. Her gentleness rebuilt a broken home, her courage healed wounded hearts, and her faith in goodness changed the lives of those who once looked down on her. She had proven that true strength is not found in power or pride, but in the quiet endurance of a soul that chooses kindness, even when the world is cruel. The poor cowboy, once dismissed as a man without value, became the embodiment of what it meant to live with honor. He fought not for glory, but for love, the kind that demands sacrifice and asks for nothing in return. Together, they turned hardship into harmony, pain into purpose. And though their story belonged to the Old West, its truth belongs to all time, that sometimes the smallest lives leave the deepest marks on the world. The rancher, once blinded by grief and jealousy, found redemption in forgiveness. His heart, once hardened by loss, learned to let go and love freely again. In blessing their union, he became a symbol of the second chances that life offers when pride is replaced by grace. The land itself seemed to breathe easier after that, the fields greener, the air gentler, as if the earth had finally accepted peace after years of unrest. Their story reminds us that no soul is too broken to mend, no past too heavy to carry into hope. The West was built on struggle, on pain, on survival, but every now and then, it gave birth to a love so pure that it outlasted even the dust and the wind. The orphan girl and the poor cowboy left behind more than a legend. They left a truth carved into the heart of the land. That goodness, no matter how humble, will always find its way home. If this story touched something inside you, share your thoughts below. Tell us what moment moved you most. And if you believe, like they did, that love and courage can still change the world, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Every story we tell here keeps the spirit of the Old West alive, reminding us that even in a world of hardship and silence, the simplest act of kindness can echo forever.